My husband blocked my access to our joint account during my cancer treatment, then he saw the balance. The card reader made a small apologetic beep, and the woman at the front desk of the oncology center gave me the kind of gentle, practiced smile people give you when they've delivered bad news before and know exactly how to soften it. "It's showing declined," she said quietly. "Would you like to try another card?" I stood there in a waiting room full of other patients, most of them thinner than they used to be, most of them wearing the same quiet exhaustion I recognized in my own reflection lately. I felt my phone buzz in my pocket before I'd even finished processing what had just happened. I pulled it out, a text from my husband. "I'm tired of wasting money on a lost cause." 12 words, sent while I stood there trying to pay for a chemotherapy session that was keeping me alive. What he didn't know, standing wherever he was at that exact moment, was that I had already quietly moved every dollar of my own money out of reach months earlier, and in exactly 9 days, when he tried to buy his mistress a diamond ring using our joint account, he was going to discover a balance of 7 cents. My name is Diane Wexler. I'm 44 years old, and 11 months ago I was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer, a sentence that rearranges every single thing about your life the moment a doctor says it out loud in a small beige room with a box of tissues conveniently placed on the desk between you. I'd spent the 16 years before that diagnosis building a successful marketing consultancy from nothing, the kind of business that let me work from home, set my own hours, and more importantly, earn considerably more than my husband Craig ever had in his career as a regional manager for a chain of auto parts stores. I never made an issue of the income gap. I've always believed that in a real marriage, whoever earns more simply carries more, and I carried plenty, gladly, for 15 years. Craig and I married when I was 29, and for most of those 15 years, I believed we had built something solid, unglamorous but dependable, the kind of ordinary happiness you don't think to appreciate until you're forced to examine every piece of it under a microscope. We didn't have children, a choice we'd made together. Early on, something that in hindsight simplified certain parts of what came later and complicated others in ways I hadn't expected. When the diagnosis came, Craig was, at first, exactly the husband I would have described him as to anyone who asked. He drove me to my first 3 appointments. He sat in the corner of exam rooms taking notes on his phone. He told me more than once in those early weeks that we would get through this together, the way you say things when you genuinely believe them, before the actual weight of a long illness has had time to settle into your daily life and reveal who someone really is underneath the promise. Something shifted, gradually, somewhere around month 4 of treatment. I noticed it first in small things, the way people usually notice the beginning of anything important. Craig started finding reasons to skip appointments, work conflicts that felt slightly too convenient, slightly too frequent. He stopped asking how I was feeling. In the mornings, a small ritual that had somehow disappeared without either of us formally deciding to end it. He began commenting, casually at first, almost like jokes, about how expensive everything had become, the copays, the specialty medications, the wig I'd bought after the hair loss started, comments that landed a little harder each time until they stopped feeling like jokes at all. I run a business built on paying close attention to patterns, to the small shifts in behavior that tell you something is changing before anyone says it directly, and by month 6 I had started noticing a pattern in Craig that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with where he was spending his time. Late nights that ran later than his job had ever required before. A new gym membership he barely used the gym for, based on how rarely his car's mileage matched the distance to the actual facility. A woman's name that started coming up in conversation with unusual frequency, always followed by some version of, "She's just really easy to talk to, that's all." Her name was Melissa Grant, 34, someone Craig had met through a work conference the previous spring, and the more he mentioned her, the more careful he seemed to be about how casually he mentioned her, which is, I've learned, its own kind of tell. I didn't confront him, partly because I genuinely didn't have the physical or emotional reserves to spare during those months. Chemotherapy leaves you with exactly enough energy to survive the day in front of you and very little left over for anything else. But partly too because some instinct I couldn't fully explain told me to watch quietly instead, to gather information the way I would for any client project, methodically, without tipping my hand before I understood the full shape of what I was looking at. The turning point came in month 7, on an evening I'd spent alone at home recovering from a treatment session, nauseous and exhausted, scrolling through our joint bank account on my phone simply to pay a utility bill before it went into a late fee, and noticing a charge I didn't recognize, a dinner reservation at a restaurant I'd Never been taken to in 15 years of marriage. On a night Craig had told me he was working late. I sat there in bed, phone glowing in the dark room, and felt something crystallize that I'd been quietly suspecting for weeks. I didn't say anything to Craig. Instead, over the following month, I began tracing every unusual charge back. Through our statements, a pattern of dinners, a spa gift card, a boutique clothing purchase, all of it small enough individually to explain away, all of it adding up to something I could no longer pretend not to see. Around the same time, I started noticing something else, something that frightened me considerably more than the affair itself. Craig had begun asking pointed questions about my personal savings account, the one entirely separate from our joint finances, built over years from my consulting income before we'd even married. Questions about how much was in it, whether I'd considered moving any of it to help cover treatment costs more efficiently. I answered vaguely each time, some instinct telling me not to give him specifics, and it was that instinct, more than any single piece of evidence, that finally pushed me to act. I met with a financial advisor named Priya Kapoor the following week, someone recommended by a friend who understood, without me needing to explain every detail, that I wanted my personal accounts protected quietly and quickly. Over 2 afternoons, I transferred every dollar of my personal savings, nearly $310,000 built over 16 years of consulting work, to a new account under a trust structure Priya helped establish that would be considerably more difficult for anyone but me to access or even locate through casual inspection of our shared finances. I told myself I was simply being cautious. Some quieter part of me already understood I was protecting myself from something I hadn't yet let myself fully name. 2 weeks after that, on a Tuesday morning, I drove myself to the oncology center for a chemotherapy session Craig had promised days earlier that he would attend. He didn't show. I sat in the waiting room alone, the way I'd sat there more and more often over recent months, and when it came time to pay my portion of the treatment cost using our joint account, the card declined. I stood there at the front desk, the nurse offering me that gentle, practiced smile, and I felt my phone buzz with a text that would end whatever remained of the marriage I'd spent 15 years building. I'm tired of wasting money on a lost cause. I read it twice, standing in that waiting room, surrounded by other patients who had no idea what I was holding in my hand. I felt something break inside my chest, a clean, sharp break, followed almost immediately by a strange and unexpected calm. I paid the remainder of my treatment costs that day using a separate card linked to my protected savings, the one Craig didn't know existed in its new form, and I drove home in silence, turning the words over in my mind. A lost cause, 15 years, and that was the phrase he'd chosen for the woman he'd promised to stand beside through anything. I didn't confront him that night. I've learned through 16 years of running a business and 11 months of fighting for my own life that the most useful response to betrayal is rarely the immediate one. Instead, I called a divorce attorney the following morning, a sharp, methodical woman named Carol Denning who listened to everything. I told her with the calm attentiveness of someone who had heard versions of this story many times before, though rarely, she admitted, with quite this level of documentation already prepared. I brought her the text message, the pattern of restaurant charges, the spa gift card, the questions about my personal savings, and the timeline of appointments Craig had missed over the previous 4 months. "This is more than enough to move quickly," Carol said. "Given that your personal assets were already protected before this text was sent, I don't think we'll have much difficulty here at all." Over the following week, Carol filed the initial paperwork, and I made a decision that felt less like revenge and more like simple, necessary self-preservation. I didn't remove Craig's access to the joint account entirely, not yet. Instead, working with Carol, I redirected the small remaining balance, transferring the last of my contributions to that account into my own protected accounts, leaving behind only the funds that had, strictly speaking, ever truly belonged to Craig's income alone, a considerably smaller figure than either of us had ever needed to think about before, since my consulting income had quietly funded the majority of our lifestyle for years. I continued my treatment using my own protected funds, driving myself to every remaining session, sitting alone in that waiting room without complaint, because at least now I understood exactly where I stood, and understanding, even painful understanding, is its own kind of relief after months of quiet suspicion. 9 days after that text message, I received a call from Carol that I've replayed in my mind more times than I probably should admit. She'd been contacted by Craig's attorney, requesting an emergency meeting regarding what he was calling an unexplained account discrepancy. Apparently, Craig had gone to a jewelry store that weekend. The kind of boutique that specializes in engagement rings, intending to purchase something for Melissa, and had attempted to pay using our joint account, the same account he'd been quietly draining for months to fund dinners and gifts he assumed I was too sick and too distracted to notice. The card had declined. According to what Carol later learned through the attorney's own account of events, Craig had gone home immediately and logged into the account online, only to find a balance of exactly 7 cents. He called me that evening, his voice carrying a tightness I hadn't heard from him in years. "Diane, what did you do to our account?" I let a beat of silence pass before answering, calm in a way that surprised even me. "I moved my money, Craig. The money that was always mine, the money that's been paying for this house, this life, and apparently, indirectly, your dinners with Melissa for the last several months." He was quiet for a long moment. "You knew," he finally said. "I've known for a while," I said. "I just didn't think it was your business to know that I knew, given that you'd already decided I was a lost cause not worth spending money on." He tried over the following days to reach some version of reconciliation, calling repeatedly, showing up once outside the house before I asked him calmly to leave or I'd call the police, a threat I meant completely and he seemed to understand I meant. Carol moved the divorce proceedings forward efficiently, and because my personal assets had been protected well before any of the joint account irregularities began, and because the text message itself, along with the documented pattern of missed appointments and diverted funds, painted an unambiguous picture, the settlement resolved considerably faster and more favorably than either of us had likely expected going in. Craig lost more than the marriage. His relationship with Melissa, according to a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it to me months later, apparently didn't survive the sudden absence of the financial comfort my income had quietly been providing for their entire relationship, dinners and gifts that had never actually been his to give. I heard he moved into a small apartment across town, considerably smaller than the home we'd shared, a home that, once the settlement finalized, remained entirely mine, purchased originally with funds from my own business years before we'd even married. I finished my treatment for months later, in remission, sitting in that same oncology center for my final session, except this time surrounded by a small group of friends who had shown up, unprompted, once they learned what I'd been quietly carrying alone for months. I rang the small bell they keep in that office for exactly this occasion, the traditional signal that treatment has ended, and I felt something settle inside me that had nothing to do with cancer at all, a quiet, hard-won understanding that I had survived considerably more than one thing that year. I think about that text message often, 12 words that ended a 15-year marriage more completely than any argument could have. I think about how close I came to simply confronting Craig the moment I first noticed the restaurant charges, how much easier it might have felt in the moment, and how much less protected I would have ended up being if I had. Sometimes the strongest response to someone deciding you're a lost cause isn't anger. It's quietly making sure they discover on their own terms, in their own time, exactly how much they were never actually paying for in the first place. If you'd been sitting in that waiting room with a declined card and that text on your screen, I wonder what you would have done in that first moment. Would you have called him immediately, or stayed quiet the way I did? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and let me know if you've ever had to stay strong while fighting for your health and your dignity at the exact same time. We have so many more stories like this one coming, so make sure you subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep this journey going.